Hello and welcome back to Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers, the podcast devoted to exploring the frontiers of psychedelic medicine and what it takes to cultivate a healthy mind, body, and spirit. I'm Dr. Steve Thayer, and today you're going to hear an interview conducted by our beloved Dr. Joe Flanders with Saj Razvi. Saj is the Director of Education at the Psychedelic Somatic Institute, or PSI. He's a psychotherapist and a former clinical researcher in the MAPS Phase 2 trial of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. Saj is faculty at Mind Medicine Australia and taught PTSD studies at the University of Denver. He's one of the primary developers of the Psychedelic Somatic Interactional Psychotherapy modality, PSIP, which is a next-generation primary consciousness-oriented psychotherapy. You're going to hear a lot about that in this interview. The focus of PSIP is to maximize the relational and autonomic healing capacity of psychedelic medicine to treat complex childhood developmental trauma. Saj's primary focus is to train clinicians to provide legal, effective psychedelic treatment in their private practice settings, utilizing readily accessible medicines such as cannabis and ketamine. He provides PSI trainings and supervision to students internationally. Saj does some really compelling psychedelic-assisted trauma work, and especially with cannabis, and his PSIP approach is really fascinating. So we hope you enjoy this interview, and if you do and would like to support us, you can do that by leaving a rating or review in places like Apple Podcasts and Spotify. If you're listening on YouTube, you can like the video, subscribe to the Numinous YouTube channel, share the episode with a friend. If you'd like to contact us, you can email us at ptfpodcast@numinous.com. Without further ado, please enjoy this interview with Saj Razvi.
All right. I'm here with Saj Razvi. How you doing today, Saj?
Hi, Joe. I'm doing well. Thank you.
Yeah?
Yeah.
You know, we were just chatting before I hit record here, and I understand that you've had a bit of a day, pretty like a heavy, big day, and just wanted to express my appreciation and gratitude for you doing this interview under these circumstances. So yeah, just thanks. And let me know if there's anything that I could do to just make this as smooth as it can be for you.
Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you. Yeah. So we just finished up a training cohort in Amsterdam, one of our European trainings. And, you know, I think you don't quite realize it, but when you're taking a deep dive into the world of trauma, early complex PTSD, developmental trauma, it sneaks up on you and just like eventually it just gets to you, and you find yourself reactive and you're wondering, oh, did something happen today? And no, nothing happened. You know, it's just sort of the water you've been swimming in for a little while. So
right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if this will be relevant to listeners, but not many people will know will have had the experience of being in that kind of deep healing space with people, and then have to transition out of it and have like a conversation like this. And so, I do know that experience, and it is quite challenging. And sometimes it can actually help with integration. So I'm hoping that, you know, this is a bit of a bridge back to some kind of balance for you, but I guess we'll have to see.
Yeah. Wonderful. That'd be great. I'll take that bridge.
Right on. Okay. So yeah, I'd like to start with just hearing your background. And I think that I'll first say that, you know, if there's anyone in this field of psychedelic assisted therapy that, you know, is in a position to innovate and, you know, speak with some authority on some of these things, I'm good with you. Your background goes pretty deep, and I would just love for listeners to hear what you've been up to the last years, because it's been quite extensive.
Yeah, I'd be happy to introduce myself. So I'm the Director of Education at PSI. I trained at a small little Buddhist-oriented psychology master's program in Boulder, Colorado. And you know, after that, I found myself going in the direction of working with trauma, simply because it seemed that when it, you know, comes to mental health, it seems like, you know, we're talking about trauma. And I found that the modalities that were available didn't for me didn't work that well. What I mean by that is, having more insight, more awareness around the patterns or where they came from, the causality of them, didn't necessarily change the reactivity at all for me. So I think that could be valuable in some ways, but for me, sort of my trauma was pre-verbal, and I didn't have very much conscious access to it. All I had access to were my symptoms. And so the direction that I went was more experiential therapies, somatic therapies. And then, I got involved in this organization called Trauma Dynamics, where it's one of the somatic modalities that's out there, but I think doing some very unique things with some of the interventions are somewhat unique to the somatic world, I think. And we also work a lot with traumatic transference, which is, relationship is a huge part of what's going on here.
Right.
And then in 2014, I got involved with the MAPS trial, the phase 2 trial, as a clinical investigator there. And not because I had experience with psychedelics, but because of my trauma background. And then initially my thought was, wow, this is fantastic. Things that, we would see people take years and years to accomplish in traditional therapy, even, I think more experiential somatic therapies, people could accomplish in a much shorter period of time. And then I thought, well, this is wonderful, but we're all going to have to wait until, the FDA approves MDMA. And then what we started to find was that, Colorado being one of the early cannabis friendly states, we started to find that the type of processing that our clients would do without medicine in the somatic sessions, they would go home and, use cannabis recreationally or to help them try and sleep. And then they would come back and report that, the same sort of processing that happens in session, that's turning on for me when I'm using cannabis at home. And I'll tell you, Joe, we found that really hard to believe.
Right.
No, this is not possible, right? Like, everybody knows cannabis. There's it's $1 billion industry. Cannabis does not do this. I thought at that time that MDMA was unique in its therapeutic potential. And what we've since discovered, starting a clinic based around working with both cannabis and ketamine, is that's not true. I mean, MDMA is wonderful. There's no doubt about that. But I think there are these other medicines that really, place us in what Robin Carhart Harris would call primary consciousness, or the psychoanalytic, the Freudian world would call primary process.
Right.
And so we just said, okay, we have to really pause on the trauma trainings that we're doing, because, there's something really fantastic that's going on here. And we need to explore it more. So we took a few years off of our trainings to do that, about 4 years. And then we relaunched our program in the fall of 2020. And interestingly enough, I'll say we were running, this is the longest introduction.
Yeah, keep going. It's great. Yeah.
We were initially running trainings that had 12 to 16 students, and which is not a large group of people at all. But we found that truly that psychotherapy in general, but certainly psychedelic therapy, is an art form, right? We are dealing with some of the most complex, powerful forces that are that I think there are that we have access to, and I would say, the complexity of doing that type of work is easily as complex as what you would encounter going to medical school and learning those systems like that. So we decided that even 12 to 16 was too large of a class, and people really learned much more through having a direct experience of the work, right? Really learning from going into their own psychedelic therapy sessions. And so then we revised our model, and now we have these 3-person cohorts we're taking over the world 3 people at a time.
Right. Interesting way to scale.
Yeah. And the outcomes are wonderful. I think people really understand some of the processes that are going on here. So yeah, that's where we are today. We're running these around the U.S. and Canada and Europe.
Great.
But outside of that, I've taught PTSD studies at the University of Denver. I'm on faculty at Synthesis in Europe, Mind Medicine Australia, and we just finished up teaching a PhD course at the University of Copenhagen. That's actually what I'm doing here in Europe, and because it was a course for Nordic countries, because they're really they want to research modes of delivering psychedelic therapy that are different than the sitter model, right? And they're looking at things like music, they're looking at the somatic pathways. So I think it's like, hopefully this is the next generation of what we're going to start looking at in terms of how do we improve the outcomes of psychedelic therapy.
Yeah, amazing. So your work hit my radar in a very specific context. And again, feeling really grateful that I was able to connect with you here. Basically, I am doing psychedelic assisted therapy. I've worked with clients with ketamine, psilocybin, and MDMA. And what I'm finding in all of those cases is kind of an inadequate level of description and modeling of the psychotherapy element. So much attention to the drug and its effects, but I'm really hungry for trying to understand, like, okay, what is my role here aside from, being a guide or a sitter or just like holding the container, but what is this psychotherapeutic process that people are involved in? And not that I've studied everything, but you're someone who's really taking that on, right? You've developed a model that is specific for psychedelic assisted therapy, and it's quite interesting. I'll also say that you talked about how important it is to learn through experience. I feel privileged that I had a session with you. We use Cannabis. We're going to talk about it later. So in addition to having read the white paper and kind of getting to know your work and stuff, I've had the firsthand experiences, sort of being your client in this little experiment we did. So I'm looking forward to kind of getting into it with you and chatting a little bit about our session, because we haven't actually had a chance to do that yet, to kind of debrief and integrate together. So I think, to get everyone on the same level here, I want to talk about your model, psychedelic, somatic, interactional psychotherapy. And actually, even break down each of those complex terms, right? Psychedelic, somatic, interactional psychotherapy, each of them. We can spend a whole interview on each of those. I think two things, a couple things to kind of address first. Your emphasis on trauma. You're working on trauma, and not it's not a psychotherapy that applies sort of across the board. Is that correct? And I wonder why that's the case.
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, I think, most of the symptoms for which people end up in psychotherapy, particularly if you're talking about treatment-resistant patients, if you're talking about people that seek out psychedelic therapy for dealing with their anxiety, their depression, their hopelessness, their panic symptoms, their numbing symptoms, their depersonalization. I mean, I think most of what we see in psychotherapy is some manifestation of trauma, right? And I think if you are aware of the ACE study, then, which is a fantastic, very large scale study done by the Center for Disease Control, I think that really does give a lot of weight to that argument that, a lot of symptoms that people are dealing with have their roots particularly in childhood trauma.
Right. And that's something I've learned as well. Actually, I'm involved with a clinic here that started offering ketamine assisted therapy, and also now MDMA and psilocybin assisted therapy through Health Canada's Special Access Program. And it really is people with treatment resistant conditions that are reaching out. And, I've worked with clients. I guess I've been doing therapy for around 12 years or something. And I've worked with clients, and we do, a few weeks, lots of mindfulness, maybe some cognitive work, behavioral work. And then for some people, it's like, oh, that was so helpful. Thanks. And then they disappear. And there are other people that keep coming back. And in a way, it's lovely because I get to reconnect with people over the years. But it does sort of raise just like, why do these tools really help some people in some circumstances, but for others it's insufficient? And I've really become sensitive to the origins, possibly in many cases, of of these symptoms in traumatic experience. The other nuance I wanted to make before getting to the model is your approach is distinct, and I've heard you talk about this, distinct from what you call like insight-oriented therapy. And you talked a little bit of this with the intro, but what do you mean by insight-oriented therapy, and how is this different?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think most therapy is, like talk therapy that works with the thought processes, cognitions, distorted belief systems. There's a lot of insight and understanding is seen as the agent of transformation. So I would say those modalities work with what's known as declarative memory, meaning that it's the type of memory that you can put it to language, you have conscious access to it. It's the type of memory that you can tell a story about. This is what happened to me. This is what happened to me in my childhood, things like that. And I think it's that part of the mind that does insight and awareness and, or organizes our experience like that is a very different part of the mind than what handles our symptoms, our sensations, our reactivity, our depression, right? So the idea here, I think, in things like cognitive behavioral therapy is that, or insight-based therapy is that thoughts tend to generate our experience. Like the types of thoughts you have will affect your experience here. The motto would be, change your mind, change your life. Change your thoughts, change your life. And I think to some degree that does work, right? But I think when we're talking about people who have trauma, which very frequently can be what is part of non-declarative memory, right? So very frequently, for example, take attachment, right? The clinical theory of attachment is that basically, our sense of other people and trust and relationship gets formed very early in life, like before the age of 2, right? Between 0 and 2. None of that memory is available to you. We don't have the type of memory developed in our brains that we can remember the experiences, the events that shaped our attachment pattern. And yet you see people in therapy for, 10, 15 years trying to work with the repercussions of their attachment style, right? And so again, having more awareness of your attachment doesn't change the reactivity to it. It doesn't tend to change that. I remember when I was in graduate school. So first of all, it's like, the majority of human beings do not have secure attachment. And I think anything other than secure attachment is a form of complex developmental trauma.
Yeah. Right. That's interesting. And can we just linger there for a second? I really find that very kind of interesting and kind of provocative, because on the one hand, I totally agree, right? And I think of this like, helpless year-old baby or 2-year-old or even through whatever, child, toddler, used to having or needs these giants to like take care of all of their needs moment to moment. Some scary things happen over the course of a day. And those needs are not always met in the best way on time. The giant isn't always in a good mood, right? Mm-hmm. And so all of that is just petrifying, right? And it's actually just part of what it means to grow up. And so I don't think we used to call that trauma, but, I think nowadays we do. And, I don't know, people make the distinction between like small T trauma or, big T trauma. I never thought of myself as having a trauma history, but like everybody else, my parents aren't perfect, and I had to adapt to certain challenging conditions. And I do recognize the sort of sequelae of that in my adult life. On the other hand, what does it mean to say that everybody's traumatized? Are we better off just saying like, we're just human. That's what it means to be human. Why do we have to bring this pathological vocabulary?
Well, because I think there was perhaps a period in our history where not everybody was traumatized, certainly not at the rates that we have in modern society. I think that the number changes, but there's something like 35% of people have secure attachment, right? So there's that population. But I think if we look to, an earlier, perhaps more primitive time in our evolution, I think that, children weren't left alone because of safety reasons the way that they are now. Right. So I think this is a much more modern development.
I see.
And just because everybody has it doesn't mean that we can't still name it appropriately.
Yeah. All right. So that's interesting. I wonder, for example, like we imagine some mythical happy place, pre-industrial, pre-civilized or whatever. And we're, hunter-gatherers, and the moms have they're breastfeeding and they've got another kid on their back and the other toddler's kind of running around, and there's just much more connection, physical, emotional, etc. But then what if there's like a drought, or some like rival tribe comes and just like murders and rapes everybody, or some virus kicks in and kills half of the population? Like, those are also like pretty nasty things that we're actually, for the most part, in civilized society, if you will, protected from. So yeah, how do you square that?
Well, no, those would be traumas too. And, and you're right. I think we have we have a trade-off here. Like, right. We don't have the types of threats that you just described. We have other types of threats that are more endemic to modern society.
Right.
And I think like those, what you're describing there would probably be considered the big T traumas.
Yes.
I got into a big car accident. There was a natural disaster, and, parts of my family were killed. I will say that, I had before moving into this training mode, I had a private practice for about 14 years, and it was 100% full of people with complex PTSD, and none of them were soldiers. Right. None of them have like the traditional big T trauma. It's really sort of that early developmental. So I would even argue that the small T traumas, if they happen early enough in life, are more pernicious. Right. They tend to stick around more.
Right. Yeah. All right. Well, so I think I can get on board calling those things traumas. Do you know Bruce Tift? He's also in Colorado.
Yeah.
Yeah. I've read his book, found it quite amazing, and I like. He uses the term adaptations, and I've really sort of taken that on. So yeah, being a modern human involves adapting through development to sometimes challenging circumstances, and there may be something about the modern era that brings out particular kinds. And trauma adaptation, I guess I'll have to try them on and see what sticks. But I think we're on the same page. I'm with you.
Yeah. Well, I'll say that, our biology, our nervous system took hundreds of millions of years to evolve.
Yep.
And
right.
We can change it we can change our environment, our circumstances in a very short period of time,
right?
Like 100 years. And it doesn't mean our biology can catch up.
Yep. Right on. Totally agree. Second attempt here to kind of get into the PSIP model. I sort of feel like the best place to start is the S, right? There's something interesting and innovative about somatic therapies that address what is not addressed by the insight-oriented therapy. So why somatic therapy? Why the somatic level?
Well, I think that, and this actually is pairing the S and the P together. Okay. So there's S for somatic and P for psychedelic, right?
Okay.
in other words, I think when we're working at the somatic level, we're working with more sort of primitive, biological, mammalian aspects of our being. And you can argue whether that's useful or not in traditional therapy, but I think if you look at psychedelic therapy and the direction that psychedelics take the brain, right, they are taking the brain in a very different neurological direction than, where we are attempting to go in most modern Western psychotherapy, which is, excuse me, which is, like we're looking for stability, we're looking for symptom management, we're looking for more insight and awareness even. And I think the psychedelic process takes us much more to our primitive minds. They take us much more to our felt sense, much more to our, interoceptive, proprioceptive experience, our concrete animal experience of the world. Which is a very different type of consciousness than the one you and I and your listeners are operating in while listening to this.
Hopefully.
Yeah, hopefully.
Do you still use the language of primary and secondary consciousness?
Yeah, it seems to fit very nicely.
Yeah,
with what we're trying to illustrate here. Yeah.
Where does that language come from, primary and secondary?
I think it's ultimately Freudian, right? It's ultimately, I think, way back in that era, like people were able to observe these sort of more distinctly human mental processes, and then also, another implicit, less conscious process that seems to run the show for people, right? So if you think of Freud's topographical map of the mind, he has the iceberg. It's the iceberg where 10% of the iceberg is visible, is your visible mind, and then 90% of who you are is below the layer of awareness, below your consciousness. So yeah, and I think most of what goes on underneath the surface of the water would be called primary consciousness. Right.
Freud said dreams are the royal road to the unconscious, right? Mm. And then, not that I want to put these two guys in the same category here, but Gabor Mate, who wrote a book, The Myth of Normal, I think just came out this fall, who's a big proponent of the view that modern society traumatizes children. Like, so for sure. He's said psychedelics are the royal road to the unconscious. And so, so there's nice kind of alignment here across generations. There's this very interesting claim that you make in the white paper. And by the way, I meant to plug that earlier. You wrote a white paper that sort of lays out the PSIP model really elegantly in a nice level of detail. So people can check that out on your website, which we'll link to in the show notes. The claim there is that secondary consciousness, the consciousness that you and I are in, hopefully, in during this conversation, day-to-day organized, consciousness to get things done, is it constrains primary consciousness. Okay. And I think what and how it constrains is actually very important for healing. And I'd like to hear you talk about that. In particular, you talk about the default mode network. Mm-hmm. And I got to slow down here because I got 7 questions coming out of you at once. But I've always been kind of fascinated by the notion of the default mode network, because I feel like it's like everyone's favorite network now, right? And everyone has an explanation of what the default mode network does. And I sort of came across it because I have a background in meditation and was fascinated by the research. The brain imaging research showed that experienced meditators can actually sort of downregulate the default mode network. And so, I'll just kind of stop there and let you jam on the DMN and in what way it's actually related to healing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, my understanding, again, this is based on the work of Robin Carhart-Harris. He wrote 2 papers on this, actually, the entropic brain model. And if people don't know, he's RCH is a neuroscientist. He was at Imperial College in London, and now I believe he's in San Francisco.
Yeah.
And just, really looks at, brain imaging, fMRIs of people in psychedelic states. And essentially, the one way of thinking of the default mode network is that it is the highest order network that we have in our minds, in the human mind. And it organizes and orchestrates the different regions of the brain that operate underneath it, so we get a smooth functioning secondary consciousness, right? So my way of thinking about this is, think about your brain like an orchestra. It has all these sections that make different sounds, and the default mode network is the conductor of that orchestra, and the music that comes out of that orchestra is your secondary consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
And it's our modern way of thinking. It's abstract. It does symbolism. It's verbal. It's goal oriented. Right. It conceives of time. Again, very much if you think about a modern adult mind, that is secondary consciousness, and it operates through the function of the default mode network.
Before you get into its impact on primary consciousness, I wonder what you make of the claim some people make, probably even Michael Pollan made it in How to Change Your Mind, that the default mode network is the seat of the ego. And when the default mode network sort of goes offline, that's sort of analogous to or corresponds to ego dissolution, and which would explain why that happens in psychedelics and meditation, which are two practices that help people achieve or diminish the role of ego in their consciousness.
Yeah, no, that sounds right to me. And I think, the theories around, I had a chance to hang out with the psilocybin research team at Johns Hopkins a couple of years ago. And I asked them straight up, I was like, so what do you guys, because they're looking at treatment-reslow resistant right? Yeah. And I asked them, we know that the serotonin model was outdated years ago. Low serotonin does not correlate with depression. I know many therapists that news hasn't gotten around yet.
Yeah.
And so, so I asked the Hopkins team, so what do you think is really going on here? And they thought it looked like there is a correlation between an overexpressed default mode network and a rutted mind, right? Yes. Basically, you're living in a world that nothing is new, it all, and there's a real rigidification of ego structure that tends to come with a strong default mode network. And they think that, it just happens through maturation, right? The older you grow, the more that this happens up until a certain point, right? As you start entering brain decline, then default mode networks starts going away, right? Let me see. What was I was going to say something else about that.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So basically the idea is that, when you take something like a psychedelic that really, psychedelics are they can target a lot of things, but one of the main things that they target is that serotonin 2A receptor, which is expressed in the neocortex and most densely expressed in the default mode network area. So, what we're getting is, and I love this articulation of it, but Carhart Harris basically says, look, what happens in psychedelics is not so much what we're adding to the picture, but what we're taking away from the picture, right? So we're taking away a level of the brain's organization, and then what arises underneath is primary consciousness, which is not affected by psychedelics.
Beautiful. Okay, so the claim here is that this rigidity that sets in the DMN actually blocks certain natural processes that we have that help us heal and restore homeostasis in our nervous system. Can you unpack that a little?
Yeah, absolutely. So, again, think about it this way. There are different networks in the brain that talk to each other and are organized to create these different modes of cognition, right? So the default mode network organizes a lot of cortical areas of the brain to provide secondary consciousness. Primary consciousness is made up of subcortical networks in the brain, and we're talking about sort of the brainstem, the limbic system, the motor networks of the brain, and so the interesting thing of how the DMN works here is that it creates secondary consciousness by suppressing the activity of these primary consciousness networks, right? Mm-hmm. And unfortunately for us, one of those networks so this is not what Carhart-Harris is saying. I don't know if I did a lit review a while ago and I didn't see anything about this, but maybe something has come out since then. But so this is what I'm about to say is not Carhart-Harris's work, but it appears to us that part of the downregulation, part of the suppression that default mode network has on the brain also suppresses a lot of homeostatic self-correction mechanisms that are part of our biology, right? That are particularly, they're part of our autonomic nervous system. Mm-hmm. And I think this is a fair thing to say simply because on a very reliable basis, we find that when people's default mode network gets downgraded by using a psychedelic, and their primary consciousness gets a boost, we find their autonomic nervous system becomes far more fluid, far more accessible to them, and this homeostatic self-correction turns on in a pretty profound way for people. Yeah.
I think the way this landed most efficiently for me was to imagine the proverbial deer in the woods that is subject to the attack of a predator like a wolf or whatever. Choose your ecosystem. And that obviously in human terms, that would be traumatic. But the deer has a way of sort of like shaking off the activation in the nervous system. Is that, have I captured the sort of metaphor adequately? And can you kind of complete it for me?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, it's a mammalian metaphor. I think models like somatic experiencing sort of reference the same thing here. Again, we're doing something quite different than SE, but we're in a similar ballpark, I would say.
Yeah.
But yeah, so here's the basic idea, right? Like threat was a ridiculously common phenomenon in the state of nature, right? If you think about it, almost nothing in nature just dies of old age, right? And so, threat happens on a regular basis. So the idea that, we've had, our nervous systems evolved under a condition of threat. It evolved under for millions of years. We were what's on the menu, as it were. And so this basic idea that, somehow we can be traumatized, but our biology did not also develop a pathway to deal with that experience, even though that's an incredibly common experience for us as animals, is kind of absurd.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so, the idea is that we see with mammals that are not in captivity, that don't have a developed default mode network, they do not have the ability to prevent themselves from processing trauma if they survive it.
Right. And what does that look like in an animal? How do they discharge or let this traumatic activation pass through? How does that work?
Yeah. Well, let's talk about something that I think many biologists have witnessed over years. I mean, you see it in Darwin's writings when, we're observing mammals, we see what's called at this point, we're referring to it as a defense cascade. And what that means is that there are these stages of that the nervous system reliably goes to under threat. And each of those stages has different capacities to it, different symptoms are to it. So, for example, like the very first stage we find is, a state of mild activation, hyperarousal, sympathetic activation. And people who know polyvagal theory can sort of map that onto what I'm saying here, which is basically, the idea here is that there's some level of threat. It's not overwhelming. It's like, imagine you're a zebra and there's a lion that's stalking you, and this lion can stalk you for an hour until she finds the perfect zebra to go for. And basically all of our systems go to this state of mild stress, which involves hypervigilance, heightened energy, heightened focus, anxiety. Basically our systems are a little bit more amped up because something might happen. Mm-hmm. Right. And if you want to think about the human example of this, think about you're walking home from work one night and you decide, I'm going to take the shortcut, and you decide to go through this dark alleyway, and you think that it's safe, but you don't know. So mm-hmm. As you enter that, then your entire nervous system bumps up to this state of mild activation where you're much more aware of sights and sounds and movement around you, right? Just in case something happens, you can respond much more quickly from this state.
Right. So that's level one.
Yeah. So that's state one on the PSIP map. The state two we find is what we call, and oh, by the way, so state one, you can live an entire lifetime there, right? So that would be, so imagine living in Manhattan, in New York City.
One big dark alley, right?
One big dark. Well, certainly, it's kind of an exciting experience, but it's also a stressful experience, right? It's the city that never sleeps. And so, just having to navigate that world with that many people and the subway systems and everything takes a little bit of edge, right? And Hawaii would be what we would call state zero, which is like that real relaxed place. Mm-hmm. So the next state that we find on the nervous system map is when the threat is active, right? So this is when the lion takes off and she's chasing a particular zebra. Or, in the human context, this is when you're experiencing an assault, or you're being shot at in war, or you're a child and, some really, your needs aren't being met. And so the symptoms of state two, high stress, are panic and hyperventilation and severe muscle contraction, fear, terror. This is state two is the realm of panic attacks, mm-hmm. right? And I will have clients on my couch where, in present moment reality, they're completely safe. They're two adults sitting in a therapy office, and they're recounting an experience where their nervous system had to go to this high level of performance to deal with the threat. And so they'll be sitting there, and their system will move into a panic wave. They'll move into severe muscle contraction, fear, all of those things, right? And then the next state is what we would call state three, which is, essentially what we're saying here is that you could be that zebra running for your life in state two, and if it works, if you get away from the line, then your nervous system will go back down to the previous state, or go back down even to state zero if you've really achieved safety. But sometimes it doesn't work, right? Sometimes you're running, you're doing your utmost, and your ability to deal with the threat is not enough to resolve the threat, right? So at that point, we hit a point of overwhelm, at which point our nervous systems go into this collapse state. So there's this real, what we think is going on here is that there's an opioid release that happens as part of the nervous system response. The pharmacy in your brain is releasing opioids because it doesn't look like you're going to make it. It looks like you might die. And essentially, it's like a possum effect, right? Where you just go from fighting and fleeing and kicking and punching to collapse, right? And everything is slowed down. So this is where people get, all of a sudden, they could be in the middle of a trauma threat response, and then they become sleepy, or they become heavy, they become confused, they become hopeless. That's another very common symptom of this state 3 that we're calling it, this nervous system collapse. They become essentially what we're seeing is dissociation turning on in their system. Depression is another big hallmark of this state. And so let me just a caveat here. State 3 is what we would call dual activated. So meaning that usually people experience those symptoms that I just mentioned, those collapsed, heavy, hopeless symptoms, but they're also experiencing state 1 or state 2 symptoms along with it. And so meaning that people have anxiety, tension, and also hopelessness and collapse at the same time.
It's like the brake and the gas pedal all at the same time or something like that? Yeah.
That's it. Yeah. Yeah. So braking the gas pedal, the car's revving, but not going anywhere.
Yeah.
Right? And then the final state that we see is, so basically state 3 happens when things are bad, but there still may be some hope, some possibility can happen. And
if
then
the lion sees the possum sort of, or whatever the predator sees the possum, is not like requires some, activation on the part of the prey to engage the sort of ambush or attack or whatever, and loses interest in this animal that appears to be dead. It's like it's a Hail Mary for the nervous system, right?
It's exactly a Hail Mary. Yeah, no, that's really interesting. We found that, predators need resistance in order to stimulate that kill response, that bite response.
That's incredible.
I know. So it's like a really beautiful co-adaptation of taking advantage of that fact. And when an animal dies in nature, it doesn't have to be laying around for long before bacteria starts growing inside of it. So there's real reason for predators to say live kill, yes,
right.
Finding something dead, no. And then the final stage that we see is when the threat is so pervasive, so like unresolvable based on your capacity, that the system has an even larger opioid release, in which case we really leave the realm of feeling, right? So again, state 3 is, I'm describing feeling states here. Depression is a feeling. Hopelessness is a feeling. Collapse, heaviness, these are all, you're in the realm of existence, you're in the realm of feeling, versus what happens in state 4 is you go blank, right? You go empty, you go, people feel floaty, they feel empty, they feel there's a depersonalization that happens there. They can feel like their body's made out of plastic or metal. This is when people see themselves kind of like floating above their body or experience themselves that way. They'll often recount what they're seeing, like the traumatic event, like a car accident or molestation or something, and they'll report it from a third person perspective.
Yes.
Right? And so the whole idea here is, so let me just one important caveat to this is that this map that I just laid out for you, where we end up on it depends on our capacities, our abilities. So for example, an adult has so much more capacity to deal with the threats in their life than an infant does, right? An infant has no capacity and outside of relying on her parent, right? And if the threat is coming from a parent, then instantly, like an infant system will very quickly go to state 4 because it's got nothing else.
Right.
State 4 is the ultimate, the blankness of state 4, the numbing out of state 4 is the ultimate solution to threat because we can't be hurt anymore. Like, anything can happen to this body, but I'm not here anymore to feel it. Right. So it's a fantastic adaptation, but it's a huge price to pay for it, which is, you're no longer in the world. You're no longer feeling. You're no longer, responsive and a part of your world. Mostly, because again, your emotions get blanked out, your body gets blanked out, and all you have left in state 4 is a cognitive capacity, right? So you can think. And in fact, I think you can think more clearly in state 4 than you can in state 3,
right.
or certainly in state 2, because you're unencumbered by the body.
Right. Yeah. So thank you for that, by the way. That was some heavy lifting and really helpful. I'm trying to sort of now map this back onto post-traumatic stress. So I think part of the story, I believe, is that certainly, I don't know, a soldier who is, exposed to like a traumatic event on the battlefield might get to any one of those stages, and then they might get sort of stuck, which is I think where we want to get to here. And then I wonder, a parallel example is like an infant or a child that experiences a trauma, and then that experience or those series of experiences can have a lasting sort of imprint on the nervous system, right? So the requirement here for the organism to recover and return to health is to sort of cycle back down to state 0 or state 1, right? And then unfortunately, some of us, again, there's the soldier and the infant, get stuck.
Yeah.
Am I capturing that right? Can you describe that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a couple of good reasons why we get stuck in this process, right? So one is, again, our fluidity and flexibility of our nervous system is not what is again been downgraded because of our default mode network. I think that definitely is part of it. In other words, there's another way of saying that is we have a choice. We get to control, whereas animals that don't have this secondary consciousness don't have this as an option. If they survive a threat and they achieve safety, their body goes into this response because they're just pure nervous system, right? and for human beings, when we survive a threat, our bodies want to go into this response. So let me. This is fantastic. Thank you, Joe, for this this opportunity. But it is biologically expensive to maintain depression, right? It is biologically expensive to maintain dissociation. Anything but state 0 is biologically expensive. So your body, your biology wants you to go to a more neutral, relaxed state if you're not under threat.
Yes.
Right. And so there's that homeostatic impulse to go to state 0. And then at the same time, we have a choice in the matter, right? So in other words, moving from state 4 to state 3 is you're moving from blankness to depression and hopelessness and collapse. All right. And when you're moving from state 3 back to state 2, that you're moving out of parasympathetic into sympathetic arousal, you're moving into high anxiety states, right? So I will tell you, remember, what creates that state 3 moderate trauma collapse state is this experience that we had where we thought we were going to die.
Right.
And so when the system is moving back from state 3 to state 2, we re-experience that. We think that oh my God, if I really do this, if I really allow this, I'm going to die. Right. At least the first time that you do it. Once you do it a few times, and then you realize that, wait a minute, no, that's not what's happening here. So I think it's just, fear of, we don't trust the body. We don't trust symptoms. We don't trust our anxiety. We don't trust, that if we let go into and truly feel these symptoms of these different nervous system states, that they're going to lead us to any place better. Mm-hmm. Right. So we typically override the process all the time.
Right. Interesting. So, there's a lot of talk about avoidance, experiential avoidance, and that creating this sort of additional debt on our post-traumatic stress, right? Another one is shame. I feel like shame is something else that keeps traumatic energy stuck. Or is shame just another thing that we avoid?
It's interesting. I think shame does seem to play a unique role in the system. It's almost like something really horrible happens to us as children, and then it seems our psyche is able to paint that experience, that event, with shame, so we know to never go back there again. It almost seems like a defense mechanism, and I don't know how important that is, because I don't think we treat it any differently than we treat any other symptom. You have to sort of step into the shame and feel the details of shame, and then it starts to melt away.
Yeah. And I just want to be really careful here, because to talk about avoidance and shame, like as if somebody just needs to like stop avoiding and like stop worrying about shame, like that's not at all what we're saying. These are particularly avoidance, like very automatic, very, as you say, kind of a defense mechanism that actually helps us get through the day. Like the default mode network is doing a really good job of helping us be stable and do what's important to us in life. But it does have the sort of this long-term cost of sustaining the symptoms, right?
Yeah.
And then, yeah, unless you have more to say on this, I wonder if we now actually talk about somatic therapy, or the psychedelic somatic piece here, which is it's like either circumventing or liberating all of this inhibition of primary consciousness, and then facilitating this natural, what did you call it, like a homeostatic corrective process, right? Have I captured that correctly?
Yeah. Before going there, let me ping off of what we were talking about before, which is absolutely. So I think people should not get the sense that anything that we're talking about in terms of these nervous system response is a chosen response that you can just, have a conversation with yourself and all of a sudden your nervous system is not going to be doing what it's doing, right?
Or a conversation with your therapist for that matter, right? Isn't that the point? Yeah.
Yeah, that's absolutely the point. Yeah. So you have to engage the nervous system on its own terms, right? This is not something that can be pushed around. I mean, certainly you can try and override it and, just expose yourself to resources or pleasant experiences, which is a necessary part of working with trauma, but that's not actually allowing the nervous system to process these events. That's much more of a different type of top-down intervention. So yeah, we're not saying by any means that this is a simple fix or something like that.
Right.
I mean,
exactly.
it's a very complex relational dance, I would say. Yeah.
So the psychedelics kind of like inhibit the conditions of secondary consciousness. We get into more of a primary consciousness type of state. And then we do something pretty interesting in your model. We get into the sensations in the body and something that you call selective inhibition, which when I first heard about it sounds completely nuts. And when I was with you in the session last week, in an altered state, having taken some cannabis, I kept saying like, why am I doing this again? This just seems crazy. So what is selective inhibition and why is it important for healing?
Yeah. So selective inhibition is one of the interventions in PSIP.
Okay. Not the only intervention.
Not the only intervention by any means. And so what it is essentially doing is that it's based on this premise, right? That for us to have the amount of stress and trauma in our bodies and in our systems that we have, and to be as functional as we are on a daily basis, our systems are having to use a lot of ongoing management strategies to constantly sort of, address these stresses and these traumas. And so all we're doing with selective inhibition is starting to target the management strategies, the avoidance strategies, the coping mechanisms, even, so I think many of your listeners who are in the therapy field might find this to be somewhat controversial when I say
yes,
this.
Exactly. Yeah.
which is because much of what we learn in graduate school is around symptom management and how to be more functional while these things are going on. And the suggestion here is it's useful to end the management, right? Yes. It's useful to end the coping, the resourcing, the distractions, the cognitive reframing, even sort of the meditation tools that people have learned to essentially, anything that causes you to sort of not be your experience, to step away from your experience, And I'm sorry, I hope we can edit that out, the thing about the meditation, because I just realized with that statement, unless I really explain it, we're going to lose everybody who's
Fair enough. No problem. We can do that.
Okay. So picking up where we left off, right?
Yeah.
So basically, there's different levels in which we find these managements taking place. So here's an example of this. Let's say you have a client and they're telling you a story about something difficult that happened to them. And in the middle of their story, they're starting to get stressed, and then they take a couple of deep breaths and they continue to tell the story. Right?
So that exact thing happened, right? I was telling you my story, and we chose a pretty low level stressor. I was in an airport. My flight got canceled. It threw off, 24 hours worth of plans. And unconsciously, I kind of snuck in like a grounding or stabilizing kind of strategy, in addition to a bunch of other stuff. But so I'm with you so far.
Yeah. So, and that's precisely what it is. It is a strategy, and it's not a very conscious strategy. It's a somatic strategy that your system is using to allow you to stay regulated and continue to tell the story. And if telling the story is the type of therapy you're doing is what's valued in that therapy, then great, right? But my suggestion here is telling the story is not all that useful, right? Mm-hmm. And in fact, what's more useful here is the reaction that just got managed in that taking those 3 deep breaths. And so we're suggesting, let's see what happens to your nervous system if you don't do anything to manage it, right? And that doesn't mean pushing it around. It doesn't mean, amping it up or doing anything purposefully. It's just saying, let's see what it organically, naturally does if you do nothing to manage it.
Yes.
And so what we find, again, on a very reliable basis, is that once we begin to end the coping strategies that people have that are really good for short-term relief, but these coping mechanisms prevent the long-term resolution of trauma, right? That's the central premise here. And so what we find is when we inhibit those short-term coping mechanisms, we find a much more intelligent, bottom-up nervous system response that emerges and gets to fully express.
Yeah.
Right.
So they're really impressive and beautiful examples of that on your website. So videos of sessions that you're conducting. Can you explain what happens when, the selective inhibition is sort of does its job? Yeah. And these healing, restorative mechanisms kick in? It's actually quite dramatic, right?
Yeah. It is it's quite dramatic in some ways, and then in other places, depending on where you are on that nervous system that
yes.
I just described, it could be more. The movement can be one from non-existence, like in state 4, to just collapse and hopelessness. So that's a much quieter movement, but it's a profound movement, right? So something I want to say is, if people go to the PSI website and look at these videos, the videos that we put there are the ones that are easier for people that are untrained to be able to track.
I see.
There's a whole other side of the spectrum that gets worked when people are moving out of dissociation. That's just as important. That's just harder to track for people that are not trained. But so basically what we're saying, what's happening here is, let's say that you have an event that let's track it from state 4 all the way to state 0, right? So let's say you have a car accident, just to make it a simple kind of experience here. And it lives when you think about the car accident, or you have to get in your own car, you just go to state 4. You just dissociate, right? You go numb. And so basically your nervous system is being stimulated into that response. And so if we're doing selective inhibition with this, right, the goal of SI is to have the client become more associated to their own experience, right? So the experience that they're having in state 4 is one of dissociation, right? People will feel floaty. They'll feel like they're in a black hole. They'll feel like, that they're in this quiet, really super quiet place, and it can feel nice. And so the idea is, we're saying to these folks, great, let's let your nervous system have that response, but take me with you, right? So one thing that we haven't touched on so far
Yes.
is that we insist on relationship as people go into these nervous system responses. And we can talk a little bit more about why that is. But once we have that, once we have the client begin to reassociate to their dissociation, right, through that selective inhibition intervention, then eventually the state 4 begins to resolve. Like people become less floaty, they'll sink down, they'll start to feel their body. Or this is the other thing that very typically happens. People will be just in bliss because they're in, they're in an opioid state, right?
Yes.
And so eventually, once you're not fighting it, again, you're having them re-experiencing it. And so eventually they'll say something like, this is okay, but I'm alone in here, right? So they'll notice some of the downsides of the price that they're paying for that kind of safety, right? And so one of the facts of state 4 is that we're not in relationship when we're that deeply in dissociation. And so people begin to become associated to that fact. And then they start to feel sadness. They start to feel heaviness. They start to feel hopelessness and collapse. So essentially their nervous system is shifting to state 3, which is a movement from non-existence back into existence. And it's a very difficult place, like I'm letting clients know that paradoxically, this is actually a good movement to if their system is choosing to feel again, right? And so we stay with that. We have them associate with the hopelessness. They'll tell me things like, this is never going to change. This has been here my whole life and it's always going to be here, right? And I'll be like, yes, keep telling me that. Let's stay exactly with that. So we're not talking them out of anything, right? Where in fact, we're looking for the truth. We're looking for the reality as it is held in the client's system, again, in relationship. And then eventually, they'll have enough of that collapse, enough of that hopelessness, and then something like this will start to turn on, right? They'll start to get a little agitated. They'll start to get a little frustrated. And they'll say like, I know I've been here for my whole life, but like, why me? Why is this my life, right? And they'll start to get a little upset. So what's happening is, again, the marble is moving left. Well, I guess people don't have a visual of this. But the nervous system is moving from state 3 up that big activation curve to high anxiety states. It's going to state 2, right? And the further they go up with that, the more that they're going to start breathing fast, shallow breathing. They're going to have more fear and anxiety responses. And so, again, we're right there with them as they're going up this big activation wave. And fortunately, panic attacks don't last very long, right? So, again, you can live a lifetime in state 4, you can live a lifetime in state 3, you can live a lifetime in state 1, and if you were very lucky, you could live a lifetime in state 0. But people don't live a lifetime in state 2. It's what we call a semi-stable state, because again, panic attacks don't last very long. People hit that state, and then 45 seconds later, their system is moving to more associated, more calm states, meaning they're either going to go to state 1 or the marble has enough momentum, their system has enough momentum that they go all the way to state 0, back to calm, right? And so we find that, again, this is an organic mammalian process, so we don't need psychedelics to do this. I spent probably 14 years of my private practice working with people without any medicines, and it works that way. It just takes a lot longer. Right. And so the boost, the facilitation that the psychedelic provides is remarkable for this. Yeah.
Fascinating. What do I want to ask you? Right. You touched on the interactional aspect here, right? That's where people need to take you with you, take you with them as they're moving the marble left, to take your visual.
Yeah.
I think I don't know how much you want to go into this, but I did want to sort of name what's especially controversial about this, right? Where you're actually encouraging people to move outside of the window of tolerance in these therapy sessions, right? And in more conventional trauma therapy, the whole sort of point of it is to work with traumatic energy or traumatic experiences in a way that stays within the window, because of the risk of what people say, call re-traumatizing.
Yeah.
And so, maybe I'll just give you an opportunity to speak to that, because it's definitely different, right? How you approach this. Even though the rationale is quite, appears to be quite sound. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah. And I would say, we follow the nervous system wherever it's going to go, right? And if it's going to these states of high activation or very low dissociation, we're willing to go with it, right? There's a reason you either trust the system or you don't trust the system. Right? And if the system's going there, then okay, it's going there for a reason, right? So my sense about this is that trauma does not live within the window of tolerance, right? Trauma does not live in a comfortable zone. Trauma lives in the extremes. Trauma lives in hyperarousal and hypoarousal. And I know that, the window of tolerance is a more complex idea than that. I think, I've heard people describe it as, you're working in the margins of that window of tolerance. So you're trying to grow the window of tolerance. But I guess my sense of this is that, well, first of all, psychedelics absolutely will take you out of any reasonable window of tolerance. Yeah. Every single MDMA trial session that I was a part of in the phase 2 trial, people would go to extreme states.
Yes.
Right. And so it seems to me kind of artificial to prevent them from doing that. Mm-hmm. Right. The way I think about it is look, if you had too much to drink, organically, your body wants to vomit to get that toxin out of your system. Right. And I would say that certainly for me, for most people, throwing up, vomiting is not in my window of tolerance at all. It's it's kind of an extreme experience if you think about it. I will hate the idea of vomiting, and yet the body wants to go there and do that. And so you can either allow it to do that, or you can, let it get close to vomiting and then try and pull it back from that. And I think that's essentially what happens in the window of tolerance. And again, I think the rationale for it was a good rationale to begin with, because, the idea is that you can't do therapy if people are outside of that range of moderation. And it prevents re-traumatization. That's the theory behind it, right? And so my sense is that working with trauma is not about tolerance. It's about relationship, right? So instead of the window of tolerance, we don't follow that, but what we follow is an attachment model. What we follow is this idea that, no matter where somebody goes, we're going right there with them. Yeah. We're going to be finely attuned to their system.
I feel like there's a piece there that I've heard you talk about that's actually important, that we make the point here, which is, I don't know if it's in many cases or every case, but one of the common features of traumatic experiences is that we're alone or we don't have someone to help us recover, right? And so that's why I think it's one of the reasons why it's actually important that the therapist in this model accompanies the client through the stages, right? Again, is there anything to add to that?
Yeah, definitely. So, think about the difference between somebody who has secure attachment in their life and somebody who doesn't have secure attachment in their life. And both of these people grow up and they have traumatic experiences, like they go to war or something like that, right? What we find is that the people who have secure attachment, that early relationship that they felt safe in, they could trust, they could rely on, they fare much better, right? In other words, the attachment, the relationship that early on is an inoculating factor against the horrors of PTSD. And so that's what we're suggesting. So basically what we take from that is that, human relationship, secure attachment is a kind of general blanket solution for almost all the traumas that happen to us in life, right? There's some exceptions to that, but I would say for mostly everything that happens to us, if you have a relationship while it's going on, it's going to be better, right? So think about it this way: like, you have a child that falls down and skins his knee, right? And then he runs over to mom and wants to be picked up and wants to have the spot on his knee kissed. Now that that won't change the healing of the injury. I say that, but I actually read something by Van der Kolk that said people who had more secure attachment, more visitations on a burn unit healed faster, actually. Wow. So the biology of it is affected too. But anyway, even leaving that out, let's say it doesn't do anything for the actual wound, but it spreads out the charge. It makes it better. It makes it more digestible, more integratable for this child that they're being held while this experience is happening. So the idea is, for most of these traumas that people have experienced in their childhood, they either didn't have a nurturing, competent parent with them through it, or it may have even been the case that the parent was the perpetrator of it. Right. So we're saying, okay, the somatic process wants to take the person back to this event. It's reenacting the event. And this time, let's inject solution, let's inject relationship, let's inject love into the middle of that traumatic experience. And we find that really supports the nervous system's movement.
Yeah. Okay. So I think we're approaching the end here. It's been a good chunk of time, and I'm going to let you go soon.
I'm good. Just okay, so you know, if there's something else that you want to cover, I'm on a roll.
Okay. I can see that. This has been amazing. I think what's coming up for me here is to keep following this thread of how this therapy works. And now I'm going to start speaking from my own experience, having gone through it. Okay.
Yeah.
So
I think that's going to add a ton of richness.
I agree. Yeah, I agree.
Right.
So I want to come back to this thing about, what's controversial, right? And it's the notion of taking away the regulating supports. Yeah. Okay. And I was sitting there, and you asked me to and for everyone's visibility here, we were working with a chronic pain I have in my neck. And I was, just kind of curious what kind of work we can do with this very somatic kind of experience that I have. And you were saying and you saw me, right? I was moving my neck all the time, trying to shift things around, feel less pain. And the instruction to inhibit all of the things that I do to regulate the discomfort associated with that pain, it just seemed crazy. It just seemed crazy to do that. And the sort of question that comes out of that experience I had is man, you better be really confident about this model to take away people's supports, right? Yeah. And there's some empirical evidence, right? You have a lot of practice-based evidence because you've been doing this work, which is really interesting, and it is compelling to me. But for me, the question is, if I'm sitting there, how do I know that, this interpretive scheme that you've brought to me, do this selective inhibition, it's going to open up all this stuff. How do we know that that's actually what's happening? So much because primary or secondary consciousness has been asked to kind of stay at the door. Mm-hmm. I've sort of surrendered to this interpretive scheme that you have and sort of imposed on this very complex kind of flow of sensations that's happening in my nervous system that is wildly enhanced by the cannabis. And it's I really hope this guy knows what he's talking about, because this is quite a challenging experience for me. Yeah. And then, these sort of conventional concerns of like, is this really a good idea? And all this kind of stuff. So I'd love to kind of land a question here. And it's something like, how are you so sure that this interpretive framework that you have is really what's happening in this complex buzzing of one's body? I guess that's the question.
Great question. And my answer to that is the proof is in the pudding, right? Yeah. So, and very quickly, I think we leave the interpretive scheme. And because remember, the transformation here isn't because you have more insight or understanding of the pain or something like that. It's the direct experience of the pain is what we're looking at, right?
Yeah.
So here's, and I would pose this question to you to sort of deepen the process here, Joe, which is that, so you're right. We are saying, all right, let's see what happens if you stop managing all of, doing the stretching, doing everything that you do to manage this pain. But that doesn't mean, I'm not telling you to like, okay, now try to create pain or try to create anything.
Right.
So all I'm saying is, what happens if you do nothing? And I think the question you have to answer is, well, why does a process turn on so powerfully in my neck and deepen this experience of pain?
Yes. Can you repeat that? What do you mean? Yeah. Why does, go ahead, repeat that.
So again, we're not telling you to stress your neck. We're not telling you to stress that muscle or doing anything. We're just saying, like, be comfortable, just sit comfortably and do nothing. And why does your nervous system then take that opportunity to deepen you into whatever process is happening in that muscle?
Right. And so you said something like, by the way, so when I did do that, I think what I experienced is what you called pressurizing the system, right? So I'm sitting there, I'm like, oh my God, I can't move. I can't do that thing. If I just adjust a little bit, I have a momentary relief. And if I just adjust this way, I'll have momentary relief. And not being able to do that was very agitating. So I did have that sense of like pressurizing the system. And I think you said something to me that was something along the lines of, if you don't explore the possibility of not managing your neck pain, you're never going to, explore the possibility of having freedom from your neck pain, something like that, which, I think now kind of makes sense. But in hindsight, I was like, wait, what does that mean exactly? And like, I'm a little altered, right? My working memory is a little diminished by the cannabis. And I'm thinking like, I don't know if that's true. Maybe it's true. And so all this to say, a lot of like, it speaks to the interactional piece. I really got a sense of like, trust is really important here. The relational piece with the therapist is really important here. The willingness to let go is really important. And one thing which we might come back to is, the cannabis made me a little paranoid, right? Yeah. It's like, who is this guy?
Yeah.
What is this? What is this?
Want?
Exactly. Does he have cookies? And it was a beautiful kind of lesson for me. And like, it would be super different if we were physically together in a room.
Yeah.
It'd be super different if I had 25 conversations with you before. And like, it really spoke to the importance of the relational aspect of your model.
Huge,
right?
Huge.
And I don't know if I'm actually just speaking about something that's idiosyncratic to me, like how much rationale and justification and really secondary consciousness kind of work I needed to do. And it really occurred to me that had we did some IFS process leading up to this, where we're working with the protectors, that might have smoothed out the process for me. I don't know if there's anything you want to respond to there, but that was kind of one of my experiences.
Yeah. So I think you're pointing to, again, how relationship plays into this. And something that we haven't talked about really is sort of, the fact that most people's traumas are relational in nature. Like, very few people come into therapy and they're working with just a car accident or a single event trauma that was non-relational, right? Most of the time it's early childhood, family of origin, repeated complex PTSD, which means that as part of the traumatic memory, relationship is always encoded.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
And so very frequently, I mean, again, that was just a kind of a first session that you and I had with the cannabis. But, you know, some people's systems will start to lean towards sort of that relational distrust, or that, you know, what we would call the negative transference piece. Like, so in other words, it could be a function of your present moment reality that you're like, I wonder, you know, he's asking me to be in this narrative of this theory and I'm not so sure about it. So that's possible, right? You could have the present moment questions about that. The other thing that could be happening is that we could be stimulating a memory from your past where relationship was untrustworthy, or you were taken advantage of, or something like that, right? So, and I'm not saying that to disregard sort of whatever's happening in the present moment, but I'll just say we very frequently see, especially with a particular version of this work where we work with sustained eye contact, that, you know, it spikes the negative transference is off the charts, right? Yeah. So oftentimes people will sit there and their visual sense of, I mean, they're looking at my face and it will change. It will become their father's face. It'll become, I'll be wearing a gruesome mask, or, you know, all sorts of things like that. And I think we're talking about relational transference here.
Is it not the case that cannabis kind of can exacerbate the negative transference? Was that just something? Yeah. Okay. So that does happen. Yeah, really. And I do want to talk about cannabis after, because, you know, your interesting claims about its healing properties, right? Which not a lot of people appreciate. I do think that if we were going to be involved in an ongoing therapy, there would be lots of like protector work and also this relational transference work. I think that's where it would ultimately go. And we'd come back. And then it was also super interesting, this idea that at first I was a little kind of confused by, but now I understand that actually there's something about my condition or my situation that makes it difficult or impossible to fully go through the PSIP model. You said something like, I'm still in the war zone with my neck. Incidentally, I got the MRI just a few days later, the results of the MRI, and I've got arthritis in certain parts of my cervical spine. And there's got to be kind of psychological layers on top of it, but I do have this sort of like organic source of pain. And so I wonder, you know, what you meant by this model doesn't work on me or in these circumstances, and what, you know, these are actually important caveats about the model in the first place, and it would be good to talk about them.
Yeah, absolutely. So the basic premise here is that, you know, when people are having these symptoms, these stress and trauma symptoms, they're adaptive responses to conditions that people are under, right? And let's say somebody's experiencing hypervigilance, insomnia, lots of anxiety, fidgetiness, because they live in, you know, in Ukraine right now, right? Like they're living in a war zone, literally. Yes. And it's appropriate for them to have those responses. And if they're going to be in that war zone tomorrow, there's no solution to what to the threat, right? So in other words, you cannot, it's inappropriate to try and resolve stress and trauma symptoms if the threat is active in somebody's life. It's like saying, you know, somebody's coming to you, they're in a domestic violence situation, and you're trying to do trauma therapy with them. Right. It's like, no, get them out of the war zone, get them out of active threat, and only after that will the system allow the symptoms to unwind. Mm-hmm. Right. These are wonderful, appropriate threats. If I'm being, you know, assaulted, I want the energy of a panic attack, like behind my muscles, sort of generating my responses. Right. So it's intelligent responses to threat.
Right. So
if you want, I don't, so I'm trying to, Joe, just forgive me, but like, I'm trying to remember specifically what was part of our conversations that led me to say to you that that you're still in the war zone, because I remember that part of it, but I don't remember the details.
I'll tell you exactly. So the issue was that I was very preoccupied about what the consequences of the selective inhibition with my neck were going to be later that day and tomorrow. Yeah. Because my experience of this chronic pain is that, you know, if I sit at my desk for, I don't know, more than 30 minutes at a time, I'm going to just, my neck and my back are going to be on fire and I'm going to be really uncomfortable. I'm going to have to like lie down. Or if I just hold certain postures for a certain amount of time, it has these downstream consequences. So my life is this like chronic management of like how I'm sitting and I'm holding myself. And you were asking me to stop doing that. Right. And I'm thinking like, but I don't want to stop because I'm going to feel I'm going to like pay the price later or tomorrow or whatever. And there's a whole kind of psychological construct around that probably needs some work. But that was what led you to say, well, like, yeah, you're going to be in more pain tomorrow. Maybe we do need to, maybe, you know, the selective inhibition rationale may or may not apply here or something. That was the conversation.
Okay. I thought there was some other, like a potential cause or something like that we were looking at. And I thought it was something that you were describing and it seemed very active other than the direct symptoms.
Not sure. Could be. I mean, again, I was in an altered state. Well, so let's just close the loop on that. Does the fact that I have chronic pain that gets worse as a consequence of the selective inhibition, is that a rationale to not do the selective inhibition or not necessarily?
Not necessarily. Okay. Again, so the way that we're looking at it is, you know, so first of all, let me back up and say something specifically about chronic pain. So when I was in Denmark, in Copenhagen, doing this researcher workshop, one of the organizers of it was from the University of Oslo, and this person, their focus area is chronic pain, right? And then I also met a doctor the following day who had a cannabis pain clinic in Amsterdam and worked exclusively with chronic pain. Both of them swore that they thought that chronic pain was completely trauma-based. That, wow. Yeah, they were saying that, look, you know, tissue heals, right? Like it may take a couple of months, but tissue absolutely heals. And their assumption set was, you know, just like we have emotions and charge and sensations that get trapped as part of a traumatic memory, their sense is that pain can also get trapped as part of a traumatic memory.
Right? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I actually buy that. Right. Yeah. And maybe in my case, it's just a bit of a longer project to kind of get into it than, you know, a Tuesday afternoon among strangers, you know. I wonder if it was my comment to you that, and we can edit this out if this isn't fruitful, but I do have the sense of like if my neck pain is worse, I become more irritable at home. And then I'm maybe not as patient as I want to be with my kids. And there's a whole kind of like ecosystem of like shitty experiences that I am concerned about avoiding. Yeah. Right? Does that ring a bell in terms of?
It's on the other side of it. So, I mean, I think what you're describing there is consequences of going into the pain. I thought you were describing something more along the lines of like, oh, when I experienced this, it was some kind of like big pattern in your life. I thought that like whenever it happened, that's when the neck pain really kind of.
Oh, yes.
What's that?
Well, it's definitely stress related. And I had this really wild, I don't know if it was an insight or this like shift in perspective where you were asking me to do selective inhibition, and we were kind of talking a little bit, and I found that my neck started to just like move without me sort of being able to inhibit it. Like it would just start to move. And one of the things it did was, I was nodding at you to like show that I agreed or reassure you or reassure myself or something. And I had the sense of like, there was this organism kind of like communicating with you and feeding back communication to myself that's operating completely without my intentionality. And it had a lot to do with staying connected to you, making sure there was ease and understanding and acceptance in our relational field. And then I find that my neck is kind of doing that a lot. And it's just like, it's managing of relationships that I was noticing. So that might be a secondary consciousness kind of process or insight there. But I don't know, again, if that's getting close to what triggered you or tipped you off into this interpretation, but yeah.
Yeah. No, but there was some, I mean, that's wonderful. And that's, I think, very useful. It's a very relational process.
Yes.
Somebody in your neck is saying like, yes.
Yeah, exactly.
But no, I guess I thought it was, I remember the conversation. I remembered having like a real sense of, I don't know, clarity around thinking like, oh, you are totally in the war zone. Like there's something going on in your life right now that maybe it's just the amount of stress from work or something like that. But like, that always seems to sort of lead to this end, and this stress was not showing any signs that it was going to go away.
Right. Yeah. Fair enough.
Anyway, so
there's definitely enough stress in my life for that to be true generally. So yeah, just super interesting. I wonder. Yeah, if we can come back to the cannabis piece, because there was something about that felt kind of strange to me as a tool here. Although I have had the experience of, cannabis being this like gentle, having this sort of gentle healing presence in my nervous system. I wonder what you could tell us about why cannabis.
Yeah. So. I guess let me preface this by saying the work that we're doing is truly a non-medicine specific modality.
Yes.
And what I mean by that is that I think no matter what psychedelic you're going in with, the more of your being that you have online to experience that psychedelic, the better, right? So in other words, it can only help that you have more of your body available to you, no matter what medicine you're working with. Now, having said that, I think these medicines in some ways all do some quite similar things, meaning that they all put us in some version of primary consciousness. And then they have their unique flavors, their unique capacities. So cannabis, I think, is remarkable. It's, I would call a one-trick pony, but the one trick that it does is amazing, right? Which is that it seems to work with dissociation faster than any other medicine that I've encountered.
Wow.
Right. And by that I include MDMA, right? So, I think anything that really is a body oriented experience is really supportive of working with dissociation. That I don't know why, that's just like what we're finding. Mm-hmm. And I think, both MDMA and cannabis are very body-oriented medicines. They just give you detailed access to your own internal experience in a beautiful way. So dissociation is the bugbear of mental health. I think, like most of the modalities that we have don't even know how to track it, much less really address it that well. I think a lot of what we call treatment resistance comes down to like people entering dissociation. And if you want to think about that nervous system map again for a moment, state 3 and state 4 are the highly dissociative states. And so not states 0, 1, or 2. And so I think the true, the heart of trauma, of these traumatic events lives in the numb places inside of us. Right. And I tend to think that, that dissociation can block the effects of psychedelics. People will have, people will take MDMA and for some unknown reason, they'll, an hour and a half after they've taken their dose, they'll feel completely sober. right? And they think that, well, wow, nothing's going on, or, you know, I'm not meant to have a journey today or something like that. They feel like they can take off their eye shades and go about their day. And I think what's going on there is that the psychedelic experience is encountering the dissociation, the opioid experience. And pretty much the opioid is crushing the psychedelic experience. So, you know, I think it could be very, psychedelics are extremely helpful to working with dissociation. And again, the one that I've seen that's most effective with that is cannabis. Like, so something that people would have, you know, like really deep, profound dissociation around, they are able to access it. They are able to sort of feel it in a much shorter period of time than we would expect.
I'm trying to understand what exactly you mean by like that it's effective. Is it just giving access to body sensations that are otherwise inaccessible? Like what makes it so effective?
Yeah. I think that, well, what it looks like. So, you know, let's do a comparison. So people with medicine or without medicine, if they go in, they might encounter some events in their non-declarative memory that just causes them to go numb. Right.
Yeah.
They don't know why they're numb. They're bored. Nothing's going on. And you can have them just stay with it and focus on the numb. And eventually the numb will begin to crack. Right. And you'll begin to see other responses underneath it. And so I've seen MDMA work like this. You know, it could go from for a number of hours of just like feeling that kind of numb to an entire, you know, 8-hour MDMA session where people are just numbed out throughout most of the session. With cannabis, what I see is, you know, maybe people will go at half an hour, 45 minutes into like a very numb place, and then they'll start to really feel like what it's all about. They gain access to it. They can, they have, you know, it will pull them out of the state for dissociation much more quickly. I could say that.
Wow, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
And again, that just sounds like what you've seen through your practice. Is there any explanation, any mechanistic understanding of that, or it's just
no? You know, I mean, it's great because I mean, you would think like, oh, well, maybe, you know, if like, you know, you're taking something like MDMA has that amphetamine molecule, right? And you could like, oh, maybe, you know, it's just charging people and they're moving to, you know, states 1 and 2 experiences because their system is amped up from what they just took. Cannabis doesn't have that, right? Cannabis works on the cannabinoid system. It doesn't have like that super activating kind of charge. Well, I don't know, maybe sativa does, but anyway, yeah, no, we don't know the mechanism behind it. We know that practically speaking, so and this is enough the case that, you know, when I was doing some clinical work in Amsterdam, people coming over and wanting to work with with psilocybin. And we had a certain percentage of folks that were complete non-responders to psilocybin. And, you know, so we, you know, they would take a full dose of psilocybin and have basically a complete non-response. Like they might see like pastoral images, like water or flowers or something like that, but nothing that connects to anything more deeper than that. And so, you know, they have to wait a few days before they try it again. And so typically we'd say, well, if you wanted to work with cannabis in the meantime, we could do that. And so for the people that did do that, we found that even 3 sessions of the cannabis work resolved enough dissociation that when they would go in with psilocybin again, it would be a significantly different experience.
Wow.
Yeah.
This notion of something stuck cracking open, right? I think that's really part of the mythology of psychedelic therapy. This is actually for my own ignorance here. Is that specifically about shifting from phase 4 to 3 or something, or is that cracking open, can that happen at any of the phases?
No, because I mean, I think it is correlated to the nervous system states, right? So
Okay.
the further you are to state 0 on that map, the more associated you are. The further you are to state 4,
Right.
more dissociated you are.
Right.
So as things, quote, crack open, what by that we mean, the dissociation.
More association.
Resolving,
Yeah.
they're moving into association.
So what do you make of the, I've seen this a few times, someone with psilocybin just getting stuck in a deep tunnel of emotion. They're associated, they're feeling, but they're really stuck there. And, in Groff's model, there's like, you're stuck in the birth canal or something. Yeah. What do you make of that? Is that a question of going? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. There's lots of reasons that people get stuck in terms of the movement that they have, whether you're looking at it through this model or not, right? I think, there may be sort of, and we've all heard about this, right? People are looping in,
Exactly,
and they're coming into horrible states. And I think if you have the sitter model, people are, the therapists know that, yep, here we are again. They're looping, but there's not much of an intervention around that. And I think there's different things that could be going on that causes that kind of stuckness or that looping, right?
Yeah.
So one is maybe there's something more dissociative that the person really needs to spend time with before they can actually move out of that loop. Like there's something else to be contacted, something else to be associated to before their system's able to leave. And so in other words, the psychedelic is doing what it's trying to do, and their dissociation is trying to protect them
right
at the same time.
Right.
Yeah.
So I was working with a client who got stuck in this kind of emotional tunnel, if you want, but who also had a very profound and beautiful release with ketamine. Mm-hmm. And I wonder, actually, maybe you can speak to ketamine for a second, how it fits into the toolbox here. And yeah, if is it like cannabis more conducive to that cracking open, or just a different beast altogether?
No, I think it's a different beast altogether. Like, I don't see ketamine being that great at resolving dissociation. So really, we don't make recommendations for our clients because we're not medical people, but for our students who we're not, we're in a training relationship with them. We recommend people begin with cannabis to, again, resolve dissociation, and then they can move to other psychedelics. And I think it would be more fruitful if they did that. Yeah. So ketamine is unique and wonderful in its own way. I would say that from how I see it, there's like two really great pathways that ketamine can work with. So on the one hand, you can use it very similar to how we use cannabis in terms of you do selective inhibition with it. And, some people will have ketamine sessions that are identical to their cannabis sessions. And so, in other words, very somatic, lots of movement, lots of like nervous system responses, things like that. The other thing, though,
hold on, is that in a psycholytic range, or is that the big psychedelic doses of?
It's a psycholytic range. It's what we can achieve through oral lozenges of ketamine, sublingual. And so that's one way to work with it. And let me just preface this by saying, I think cannabis is a very narrow psychedelic experience. Yes. It, again, resolves dissociation and really helps people discover that nervous system pathway in their system. So it's super helpful for that. The ketamine, on the other hand, I think is a much more wide spectrum psychedelic, like psilocybin. You can do all sorts of different types of work with it, right? So the interesting, I think a very interesting use of ketamine is for people who might come into therapy and they're not appropriate candidates for using a psychedelic as a processing agent, right? And what I mean by that is they don't have enough resources on board, right? So even though we're inhibiting resourcing and distractions during the psychedelic therapy session, we absolutely want people to have good management strategies when they're out living their life. Yep. Right? Live in the window of tolerance when you're picking up your kids from school, right? Things like that. But you'll have lots of people that come into therapy and they don't have the capacity to resource. They don't have the capacity to feel connected or good. They don't have solutions in their life. Like they don't have any sense of what secure attachment would look like, for example, right? So what I find ketamine could be wonderful for is that you can use it to really soften the defenses that people have and create these very wonderful corrective emotional experiences inside of people, right?
Okay.
So, for example, if you have somebody that's very guarded and they're very protected, don't trust people, like stay away, but they're in therapy with you. In a ketamine session, that person might say to their therapist, "Can you hold my hand?" Right? Mm-hmm. Which is, to somebody who doesn't have that structure, that's like, oh, that's no big deal, right? But for that person, it's huge, right? So little bits of reaching out, or, I often see people in that ketamine space as becoming really wide-eyed children.
Yes.
Right? And I recommend our students be really thoughtful and careful with the types of interactions they have with people on ketamine, because people will try on anything that you say to them. You can you have really deep access, almost I would say maybe a hypnotic level of access to their core programming.
Yeah.
Right. And so you can have these beautiful interjects that you implant there.
That's absolutely true to my experience, and highly dependent on dose. And something that we struggle with in terms of we use the lozenges and the nasal spray, and it's just nowhere near as clear and efficient as the IM or the IV approach. But I've definitely seen that. Saj, this is so fun. I could do this all day. It's got to be close to bedtime or dinner time or something for you.
Pshaw. It's about 9:40 p.m. here.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'm going to let you go. I had so much fun doing this, and I'm so grateful for all the time, your generosity with your time here, and I hope we get to do this again sometime, and maybe we got to bring you for a training, or I'm going to go to you for a training or something. Cause I'm just this super inspiring and like I said, just sort of filling a gap that I'm perceiving in terms of okay, what is the psychotherapy piece that we're doing with the psychedelics? So that's it. Thank you so much,
Joe. Wonderful. Thank you. Loved being here. Loved our conversation.
Cool. All right. Take care.
Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers is brought to you by Numinous, a mental wellness company committed to tackling the global mental health crisis by delivering best-in-class psychedelic-assisted therapies, contributing to the body of primary and clinical psychedelic research, and fostering healing through community connection and social responsibility. You can learn more about Numinous at numinous.com. That's Numinus.com. If you enjoyed the show today and you want to support us, here's how you do it. Rate and review the show on platforms like Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Subscribe to the Numinous YouTube channel, like the videos, and share it. Share the show or clips of the show with someone that you think will enjoy it. The content of this podcast does not constitute medical advice or mental health treatment. Consult with a medical or mental health professional if you believe you are in need of mental health treatment.